The road to Black Hollow wasn't marked on any modern maps. It was a name whispered in passing, a cautionary tale among the nearby townsfolk. I had first heard of it while researching lost settlements, places swallowed by time or erased for reasons unknown. Black Hollow was different. It hadn't vanished. It had been abandoned. I arrived just before dusk, guided only by an old, hand-drawn map I had found in a forgotten archive. The path was overgrown, trees pressing in from both sides, as if nature itself was trying to keep people away. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds. No wind. Just an unnatural stillness. Then, the village emerged from the thick fog. Black Hollow was eerily intact. The wooden houses, though weathered, stood firm. The cobbled streets remained mostly unbroken. It was as if the people had left in a hurry. But why? At the heart of the village stood an ancient chapel, its steeple rising like a skeletal finger toward the sky. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. There were no windows. Just a single, towering door, adorned with a faded carving of an eyeless figure surrounded by clawed hands. A chill ran through me. I had come to Black Hollow seeking history, but as I stood in the dying light, I realized I had found something much worse. Something was waiting here. And the shadows were watching me. The silence pressed against me like a heavy weight. As I stood before the chapel, the carving on the door seemed almost alive in the dimming light, its eyeless figure looming over me, its clawed hands stretching outward. The wood felt strangely warm beneath my fingertips as I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Rows of pews stood in perfect alignment, untouched by time. But it was the altar that caught my attention. A massive, blackened stone slab stood at the center, its surface etched with deep, swirling grooves. Old, brittle parchment lay scattered at its base. I picked one up, my pulse quickening as I read the faded ink. The shadow must be fed. The shadow must be honored. The shadow must never be seen. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, a slow, deliberate creak from the rafters above. My breath hitched. I lifted my flashlight, sweeping it across the high ceiling. Empty. Then the door behind me slammed shut. I spun around, heart hammering. The chapel was still. No wind, no movement. But the air had changed. It felt occupied. I wasn't alone. And whatever was here didn't want me to leave. The room seemed to shrink around me, the air pressing against my skin like unseen hands. I swallowed hard, gripping my flashlight as I turned back toward the altar. The blackened stone slab now seemed darker, almost pulsating. A whisper slithered through the air. Not words, just a sound, a slow exhalation that sent a chill down my spine. Then I saw it. In the far corner of the chapel, where the candlelight barely reached, a figure stood. It wasn't moving, but I felt its presence, as if it were watching me through unseen eyes. My breath hitched as I raised the flashlight. The beam flickered. For a second, just a second, I saw something wrong. A shape that didn't belong to any person. Limbs too thin. Fingers too long. And where a face should be, only shadow. The light went out. Darkness swallowed the room. And then, from the corner, came a sound. A scraping, slow and deliberate. It was moving toward me. The scraping sound was unbearable. Metal against stone, slow and deliberate. My fingers fumbled for my flashlight, shaking as I smacked it against my palm. Nothing. A whisper, low and guttural, curled through the darkness. You see now. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, layered, like multiple voices speaking at once. My breath hitched as something cold brushed against my arm. I yanked myself back, stumbling over broken stone, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The room wasn't empty anymore. The darkness itself seemed to shift, to move, folding in on itself like a living thing. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The whisper came again. You came looking. Now you belong. A hand, long, skeletal, its fingers stretching impossibly far, emerged from the shadows and reached for my throat. The skeletal hand closed around my throat, its grip cold as ice. I gasped, struggling against the impossible strength holding me in place. The shadows coiled around me, thick and suffocating, like they were alive. "You belong." The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was in my head, pressing against my thoughts, unraveling them. My vision blurred. Was I still in the chamber? Or somewhere else? My mind felt detached, floating in the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the grip loosened. I dropped to the ground, choking on the thick, stale air. My flashlight flickered to life on its own, illuminating the space. The chamber was full of figures. Not people, at least, not anymore. They stood frozen, their faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes wide and lifeless. Their bodies had become one with the stone walls, their limbs half buried in the ancient rock. I scrambled back, my foot knocking into something solid. A book, thick, bound in cracked leather. The cover bore a single symbol, a jagged eye, carved deep into the flesh of the binding. A gust of wind rushed through the chamber, though there were no windows, no doors. And then, the whisper returned. "Open it." My hands trembled as I reached for the book. The leather binding was unnaturally cold, as if it had been left in a crypt for centuries. The jagged eye carved into the cover seemed to pulse under my fingertips, almost as if it were watching me. I hesitated. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drop it, to run. But something deeper, something older, compelled me to open it. The second I flipped the cover, the chamber breathed. The air around me shifted, thickening like mist rolling over a graveyard. Words scrawled in a language I couldn't understand covered the brittle pages, moving as though they were alive. I felt my mind stretching, unraveling, deciphering the impossible script. Then I saw it, etched into the pages, staring back at me, a figure made of shadow, arms outstretched, mouths where its eyes should have been. A deep voice rumbled in my head. The first to kneel was given power. The last to resist was consumed. A horrific realization crashed over me. This wasn't just a story. It wasn't a legend. It was a warning. And I was next. The chamber pulsed around me, the flickering candlelight warping the walls into twisted shapes. The words on the ancient pages slithered like ink bleeding through time, whispering secrets my mind wasn't meant to comprehend. I forced myself to keep reading. The first to kneel was given power. The last to resist was consumed. The meaning sank into my bones. The village hadn't just worshipped the shadow, they had fed it. And when one refused to kneel, the darkness swallowed them whole. A rustling sound echoed through the chamber. I wasn't alone. I turned, my breath catching. In the doorway stood a hunched figure, draped in tattered robes. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its hands, *** long, skeletal fingers with nails like blackened daggers, *** were stretched toward me. "You have read the words," it rasped. "Now you must choose." The room grew colder. The presence of something ancient coiled around me, waiting. I realized, in that moment, what had happened to the villagers who resisted. They weren't just consumed. They became part of it. The figure loomed in the doorway, unmoving. Its presence felt heavier than the air itself, pressing down on me like unseen hands. I took a step back, but the chamber walls seemed to tighten, closing in like a throat swallowing its prey. "Choose." The whisper slithered from the darkness. I turned back to the ancient pages, my eyes tracing the words I wished I had never read. There were only two choices: kneel or be taken. A sudden scraping sound filled the room. The walls shifted. Shadows stretched unnaturally, reaching for me like living things. Faces formed in the darkness, twisted, hollow-eyed remnants of those who had resisted before me. Their mouths gaped open in silent screams. I had no way out. My breath hitched as the figure stepped closer. The candlelight flickered, revealing a glimpse of its face, or what was left of it. A void of shifting darkness where features should have been. No eyes. No mouth. Just a swirling abyss. My fingers clenched into fists. I couldn't let myself become part of it. But I couldn't kneel either. Then I saw it. A crack in the chamber wall. A faint sliver of moonlight seeping through. I didn't think. I ran. The moment I moved, the chamber erupted in a deafening, inhuman shriek. The shadows lunged, clawing at my skin, cold as death. I reached the crack, my fingers scraping against the stone, prying it open. A hand, not mine, gripped my wrist. The hand tightened around my wrist, its grip ice-cold and unforgiving. My scream barely left my throat before I was yanked backward into the suffocating darkness. "You cannot leave," the voice rasped, though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The chamber pulsed, its walls shifting like living flesh. The shadows swarmed, forming grotesque figures with empty, yawning mouths. The faces of the forgotten villagers, those who had tried to resist before me. Their fate was clear. I fought against the unseen force, my nails digging into the stone floor, but the pull was relentless. My body was being consumed by the darkness itself. Cold seeped into my skin, crawling through my veins. Then, I heard it, a distant bell. The villagers outside. They were still chanting, still feeding their god of shadow. My mind raced. If they were sustaining this horror, then breaking their ritual might be my only chance. I reached into my pocket, my fingers trembling as they closed around the lighter I had forgotten was there. With a desperate flick, a small flame bloomed to life. The chamber reacted violently. The walls trembled. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in rage. The hand gripping my wrist loosened, just for a second. It was enough. I lunged for the crack in the wall, shoving my shoulder against it with everything I had. The stone gave way, and I fell through. I landed hard on the forest floor outside, gasping for breath. The air was sharp and real, the moon above almost blinding after the abyss inside. Behind me, the chamber entrance began to seal itself, the shadows twisting in fury. The village bell tolling faster. I wasn't free yet. I had to stop the ritual, before the shadow claimed me forever. I stumbled forward, my body aching, my mind screaming at me to keep moving. The village bell tolled faster, the air thick with chanting voices. The ritual was reaching its peak. I reached the village square, where the villagers stood in perfect formation around the black stone altar. Their heads were bowed, their lips moving in eerie unison. The shadow loomed behind them, its shifting form writhing like a living void, stretching its limbs toward the sky. It was feeding. If I didn't stop it now, I would never get another chance. My fingers tightened around the lighter. Fire had hurt the shadows before. Could it destroy them completely? I lunged toward the altar, knocking over the offering bowl. The thick, dark liquid inside splattered onto the ground, breaking the perfect circle of symbols carved into the stone. The reaction was instantaneous. The shadow let out a sound that was neither a scream nor a growl but something far worse, a ripple of pure agony. The villagers turned as one, their blank eyes suddenly aware. The spell was breaking. I didn't hesitate. I flicked the lighter and tossed it onto the spilled liquid. Flames erupted, racing along the symbols, burning through the darkness like a cleansing force. The shadow reeled backward, its form distorting. The villagers clutched their heads, screaming as if something was being ripped from them. The bell let out one final toll, then shattered. A powerful wind surged through the village, carrying with it 1,000 whispers, 1,000 lost voices finally freed. And just like that, the shadow was gone. The villagers collapsed, dazed and confused. Some cried. Some stared at me in horror. I didn't wait for their gratitude or their blame. I turned and walked away, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me. As I reached the forest's edge, I glanced back one last time. The village was silent, empty, as if it had never been there at all. And in the distance, where the altar once stood, I swore I saw a figure watching me. A shadow. Still waiting.